Happiness is what's happening right now. It's not next week, it's not tomorrow, it's not the dance you're going to go to. If you're not happy right now, you're not happy.
Seniority Authority exists to answer your questions on aging. The world has changed dramatically in a generation, with more retirees than ever before, living longer with more choices. If you're an older adult or have an older adult in your life, where do you go to begin to understand those choices? I'm your host, Cathleen Toomey, with over a decade of work experience in retirement communities. I can track down the right people to answer your questions. So send your questions on aging to me, and together, let's get smarter about growing older.
Welcome, I'm Cathleen Toomey. What if we could learn lessons on happiness from those who've lived the longest? What would they have to say? Today, we're going to learn that in our interview with award-winning New York Times writer and author, John Leland. Stay tuned.
Thanks to our show sponsor, the Riverwoods Group, Northern New England's largest family of nonprofit retirement communities, where active adults find community, purpose, and peace of mind. Visit riverwoodsgroup.org. Now, let's hear from today's guest.
My guest today is John Leland, an award-winning New York Times reporter and author who spent a year following 6 New Yorkers age 85 and older to learn about America's fastest-growing demographics. What he expected to write about were the challenges and obstacles we usually associate with that age. But what he discovered was something unexpected. His results are detailed in his latest book, Happiness is a Choice You Make, Lessons from the Oldest Old. Welcome to the podcast, John. It's great to have you here.
Well, thanks, Cathleen.
So this is an extraordinary proposal that you made to your editors to follow several 85-year-olds around for a year. What made that newsworthy to begin with?
Well, it really grew out of a census report showing that people age 85 and up are one of the fastest growing demographics in the country. I love this. When I was born, there were fewer than 1 million, and now there's more than 6 million. So if there were 6 times as many teenagers running around, we would A, be a little bit alarmed, and B, we'd really want to know what got them going, what their lives were like, what they thought about things. And that's sort of how I approach this thing. If there are 6 million older folks now, if their population is doubled, is multiplied by 6 in a relatively short period of time, what's life like day to day? What gets them going? What do they worry about? What are they afraid of? What do they look forward to? And really to get way down there, what made life worth living and what made it no longer so. And I knew that the people I really wanted to learn this from were the experts, the people who were living it. And so much of what we think we know about old age comes from people who have never been old.
That is absolutely right. And I just want you to repeat that because I think it's worth pausing a moment. And we do have a lot of stories and articles and books written about getting older, but this is a different perspective.
What does that land look like once you've visited it? Who's been there? If someone had been to the high reaches of the Himalayas, we would ask them, what was it like when you were there? What did you learn? What did that tell you about your journey that led you up there? All that happened before. So if people have been to the far reaches of chronology in the number of years, don't we want to know from them, what's it like? And I had to say, I had to get over my own tendencies, which are to think that I knew, that I was the true expert. I'm a New York Times reporter. I'm this fancy person. I did a lot of reading. I read up on what the gerontologist said. I saw the plays about aging. I saw the TV shows and movies about aging. Didn't I know what it was like? And turns out, lo and behold, I didn't. Luckily,
Did you have a premise that you were going to try to explore in this series of interviews?
well, I try to be as open-minded as I can and just approach any sort of story I do as a bit of a blank slate. But I certainly went in with my own prejudices, and they were that I would be writing about health problems and depression and despair. And what do you do now that your life is over? And I thought, I had this view of life that so many of us have, that life is an arc, and there's a high point of your arc, and you go along and you go along, and then you hit that point, and then things sort of start to go bad. And I thought that people over 85 were at the extreme part of that decline. So that my stories, I expected, were going to be the malady of the month. One of the people is going to fall this month, and then their life's going to go on a downward spiral. Someone's going to start to lose her memory, and then her life is going on a downward spiral. And the other person ran out of money, and his life was on a downward spiral. And what I found was the people, some of them had quite a few of the challenges that I expected them to have. But, none of them defined their lives that way. Only other people define them that way. And this was sort of the start of an eye-opening revelation for me that how we define our lives, how we look at our own lives, plays an important role in the quality of those lives, how we live them. And that we all, whatever age we are, we've all experienced losses, we've all experienced change, and it's our choice whether we want to live for the things that we have now or can still do, or to define our lives by what we've lost. What impressed me so much about the 6 people I followed was that really, with maybe partly one exception, none of them defined themselves by what they lost.
Wow, that is quite a difference. And I give you credit for even being interested in this project when you thought you were going in to kind of document people's losses, because I do think that's what we think about it when we think about age. It's a series of losses. Tell me, what were your journalistic habits? How did you literally followed people? You literally showed up on their doorstep and were accompanied them for the day?
I would always call ahead, but I would mostly come and they were 6 people. They were different ages. I mean, they weren't such different ages, but they were different health statuses and different races and different socioeconomic groups, ethnicities. And I would just call up and say, Mrs. Wong, can I come visit you today? And I would spend some time with Mrs. Wong. And the next day I would call Mr. Jones and ask him if I could spend some time with him. And we would do different things. Sometimes I would go out with them, but sometimes we would just stay home and sit around and talk. And I think that I always got a lot out of this, and I think that they got something out of it too, because they had a visitor for the day.
Oh, absolutely. I would think that you'd get a lot of enthusiasm from them on the project. How did you choose? I know people would be very interested because it is they all live in New York, as do you, but they all have very different backgrounds. How did you choose the people that you chose to follow?
Well, New York, remember, is 8 million people, so it's a big group to deal with. And
hard to pick 6 out of 8 million.
Yeah. So I wanted that kind of diversity. I wanted, they're black and white and Asian, and they're gay and straight, and they're living anywhere from a nursing home to, a loft in a hipster neighborhood in Brooklyn. So they really kind of ran the gamut. I wanted a couple who had met late in life and fallen in love, because I think there's tremendous courage to that, especially, one of them had cared for her husband over his last years. And I thought it was really hard to give yourself to another person at that late stage in life, in a nursing home in that case, knowing that it's not for a long time now, and that one of you will probably have to watch the other one decline. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted that, I wanted a gay man or lesbian, because I felt I didn't know anything about that journey, that gay life after a certain age. And I gave myself one ringer. I knew I was going to spend a year with these people. So I gave myself one ringer, somebody I knew was going to be a very good talker. And that was the filmmaker Jonas Mekas, who was a Lithuanian refugee. And he had come to New York and he'd become part of the art world with Andy Warhol and Marlon Brando. And John Lennon and Yoko Ono were his friends. And so I thought, like, whatever else happens, I know that Jonas is going to have great stories about New York.
He will be interesting.
But what happened was, again, I thought other people were just going to tell me about how their back hurt today. They were all incredibly fascinating. And they all had such great lessons for me. And they're things that I get to apply to my life day in, day out, in good circumstances and in bad circumstances.
Can you share a couple of those stories with us?
Oh, yeah.
That lessons that you've taken, whether it was Jonas or Ping or Helen or John?
I think when I first started to make my change in my thinking was when I visited Fred Jones. And Fred was, did I just lose you?
No, I'm still here.
Oh, okay. It went to a different window for some reason. Okay. And Fred Jones was, he was a World War II veteran, a really talkative guy. But he was 87. He was in the process of losing 2 toes to gangrene, and his closest daughter was dying of stage 4 breast cancer. So, it was the hard life I was expecting. He had limited mobility and he had health problems and didn't have a lot of money. And I asked Fred, what's the best time of your life? And Fred said, right now. And
wow.
It just kind of floored me, because if you asked me that, I don't know that I would have said that. But there was Fred. And what he meant was that joy is what's happening right now. Happiness is what's happening right now. It's not next week. It's not tomorrow. It's not the dance you're going to go to. If you're not happy right now, you're not happy. And I needed to kind of get to the bottom of that. And Fred was so much fun. Fred was a player. Fred had 6 kids by 4 different women.
Oh my gosh.
And he had a dirty joke to tell every time I saw him. And he was always trying to get me to fix him up with this real fine chick that he was sure that I knew.
One of the other study people, perhaps?
No, Fred was really interested in younger women.
Oh, okay.
But so I didn't get it. I didn't get how Fred was always in such a good mood. And I said, what's your favorite part of the day? And he said, waking up in the morning and saying, thank God for another day, on my way to 110. And wow. that was just amazing to me, because I thought, that's something I can't do everything that people do, but that's something I can do, is when I get up in the day, just think about one thing that I'm grateful for, 2 things that I'm grateful for. Is there something good? Is there, I woke up this morning and I wasn't a widow with 6 kids in Aleppo. That was for a while. That was my mantra. But then I just started really just applying it to my life and just trying to do it, several times during the day. What are you grateful for? Mm-hmm. All these good things that I have. Just sometimes it's just waking up and saying, thank God for another day. We have all this thing that we're given. And so I started to do some research on this, and I found that people had studied gratitude. It's become like a discipline in our academic circles. And they found that people that do that make note of just something that they're grateful for on a regular basis. They sleep better. They become more optimistic about the future. They describe a higher level of well-being. And there's physical changes, like lower blood pressure and better immune function and less inflammation and lower stress hormones in the system. And I thought, like, if there was a pill that would do that, how much would we pay for it?
Oh, it'd be flying off the shelves.
We'd pay a fortune for it, but you can do it in the time it takes to brush your teeth. Just, isn't this lovely? I'm here brushing my teeth. Isn't this a great thing? And so when I started to do that, A, it really improved my life. But B, it helped me see that the elders that I was spending all this time with really had something to teach me. They had lived through experiences that I didn't have. And instead of shutting them out, the way our culture so often does, and says, oh, Fred, you can't learn Instagram. Fred, what can you tell me? Jonas, what can you tell me? Ping, Ruth, Helen, what do you know about life? Because you've lived it much longer than anybody. So if I start to look at these people as the true experts on living, what can I gain from that? And I was at a not an easy part of my life. I was in the middle of a divorce. I was, at some point, had my foot in a cast because I was having foot problems. I was finding my mood was great through all of this. And it was because whenever I was down, I'd visit Fred or visit Jonas or visit Helen or Ruth or Ping, and it just kind of lifted me up.
And that must have been kind of humbling because as you say, you're a pretty famous writer and you've won a lot of awards. And I would think you would come in saying, I know a thing or two. And I would think you would come in thinking that you had something you were going to teach them or something a point you were going to make. So for you to say, what can I learn from you? And putting yourself in that position of being a receptor of their knowledge, I bet was really exciting for them as well.
Well, I hope so, but it was certainly exciting for me. And the great thing about humbling experiences is it's suddenly recognizing that I don't need to do all the work. And once I let go of that work, then I get to enjoy this banquet that's all around me. I don't have to go into that fancy restaurant and go into the kitchen and cook the meal myself. There's actually really great cooks that'll cook it for me, and they'll bring it to me at the table. And they've learned all this stuff, so I don't have to learn it. And it takes a little step to get there and accept that. But once we accept it, it makes life so much easier. And I was finding that these little bits of joy were kind of reinforcing. Hey, I tried not thinking I was the expert today, and that worked out pretty well. I think I'll do that again tomorrow or maybe next week.
And so this was perhaps something somewhat unexpected that you didn't anticipate getting out of this assignment, was it? You didn't walk into this assignment saying, how am I going to become happier in my life?
Oh, completely. This would have been the last place I looked to learn about happiness. And also, I really maintain an objective distance as a journalist. That's part of what we do. So I never expect to be changed by stories. Otherwise, we couldn't do some of the work we do, because sometimes we'll get next to people in really, really distressed parts of life. And if you weren't able to kind of distance yourself from these a little bit, I think journalists would be,
emotional wrecks.
Yeah, emotional wrecks, day in, day out. So we have to do that. I found myself being able to let that go a little bit. But really, I expected to see the people I was following change over the course of the year, because their health was going to change. Everything was, they were really at the edge of some real transition of life. But I didn't expect me to change. And when I found myself changing, it wasn't that I had to do all this work to change. It wasn't like becoming an Olympic athlete where you have to, I'm going to get in the pool and swim 8 hours a day. It was kind of stopping doing some of the things I was doing and making some really, really simple steps in my own life. Wisdom that I think we all carry around with us all the time, but we just don't tap it.
So tell me another thing that you've done, one as a result of who you've interviewed. So one was to express gratitude and be grateful for the moment right now and
Mhm.
be right in that moment that you learned from Fred. Who else taught you something that has stayed with you past the
Well,
publication of the book?
yeah, there was, I mean, they really all did. But I always loved thinking about Ping Wang, because Ping, 90-year-old Chinese immigrant woman, she always had a lesson about something. I think she felt she was put on this earth to teach people. I don't think she always told her lessons so gently to her daughter, but that's another story. But she always had philosophy. She was like, why aren't you traveling more? Why aren't you doing this? Here's what you should do with your money. Here's what this. But Ping was, as I said, she was 90 and she was living on $700 a month in Social Security. And
Wow.
she couldn't afford her pain medications for her joints. So she'd cut the little lidocaine patches in half to make them last longer. And she never defined herself by these losses. She was the master at that. She said, I never think about what I have lost. You know, I know my time is limited, so the only thing I have to do is enjoy myself. Like Mahjong. I will do it till my last day. She loved playing Mahjong.
Really?
And so it was just that reminder that all the things that we have in life, we've lost some things, we've all lost some things. But the things that we have for us are still the makings of a good life if we're living for them. If we're living for some myth of our lost youth, we're going to be unhappy because we can never get that back. If we're living for these three women around the Mahjong table with me that I've known for a long time and speak the same dialect of Chinese that I speak, and we share some experiences, if I can live for that, if I can define that life as having everything I need of it right now in this moment, then my life is good. And there's always that cliche we hear all the time about living in the moment that I've never really understood. But I started to understand it through people like Ping, who just, if she was happy in that moment, if Fred was happy in that moment, if the others were happy in that moment, then they were happy. There was everything they needed of life was there right that second.
And that would be, I think, what a lot of older adults maybe don't do so often. They look backward on their life and they yearn for what they had and what they were. And I think accepting where you are, so gratitude for the moment is one thing, and then accepting where you are and who you are, what stage you're in, perhaps is another way of rephrasing what you're saying is she was happy to be at the mahjong table. She didn't yearn to be a young mother again or a worker again. Would that be a correct way of interpreting that?
Yes. So she cherished those memories in the way we cherish things that we've stored up around our house, like the mementos from her travels when she used to travel. But she didn't think she needed to go back there. Those were things she had. That was like money already in her bank. She had those experiences. Now she was having new experiences. What did those new experiences mean to her?
And it seemed like with both she and John, that they didn't focus on the significant poverty they were living under. I mean, it's hard in New York to survive without money, and yet they were surviving and flourishing with very limited income. But it seems like something they didn't dwell on, which feels unusual to me. Does that feel unusual to you?
Yeah, and Ping described this as something that she had come to later in life, and maybe Fred came to it later in life as well. Now that she was over 80, and she was relying on Social Security, her income was steady. She lived in a very affordable apartment, less than $300 a month rent, very nice apartment. Her health care was mostly paid for. So she didn't have that kind of striving mentality where she had to worry about tomorrow. And she put this really well. She said, when you're young, the world is so big and you don't know what's going to happen. And you have all these worries. Am I going to have enough money to live 10 years from now? Where am I going to be? Is anyone ever going to love me? And she felt that she didn't have those worries anymore.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. What did you see? One thing that I think I hear a lot about with working with older adults is that as they get older, they lose so many friends, and the colleagues pass away. Yet the group that you interviewed, even though they had experienced losses, they seemed to retain friends even as they aged. Did you learn something from them about how to collect and inspire friendships later in life?
Well, they did also lose friends, of course. Everybody does at that age. And Fred lost his daughter in the course of the time I spent with him. But I think that they were very sort of creative about forming friendships. Most of them had lost a spouse. Mm-hmm. And very few were interested in having that kind of relationship again. But they did want to replace a lot of the things that they had with the spouse. They wanted, someone to talk current events with. So they had a current events friend, and they wanted somebody just to have lunch with and maybe share gardening tips. So they had that gardening friend. And they were able to have these friends who all meant something to them. They didn't have the relationships that we have in middle age or when we're younger that are professional relationships. Maybe this person will be useful for me down the line. I need to be nice to this person because, it's my boss.
Yeah.
They didn't have any of that. So it was a choice whether they wanted to associate with people, and they could just put their energies into relationships that were nourishing to them and kind of withdraw from relationships that weren't, which is a luxury that we don't always think we have.
So less obligation and more preference in what's going to enhance my life.
Yeah, life is too short. It's always too short to spend time with those people that make us miserable.
Right.
Even though we all do it to an extent.
Exactly. I love the title of your book, Happiness is a Choice We Make. And my assumption is that's the lesson that you've learned from your 6 friends that you've followed. When people ask you what you would recommend, and for listeners of this episode, no matter what age they are at, what would you recommend they start or stop doing to reclaim more happiness?
Well, I think the first 2 things are the things that I mentioned. Mm-hmm. Gratitude, that's sort of that daily practice of gratitude. And you might think, oh, this is kind of stupid. It's mechanical. Just gratitude should well up in us spontaneously. Mm. I don't buy that. But the truth is your body doesn't know the difference. If you do that, you have these neurochemical changes in your brain that signal differently. That you've got the transmitters that produce happiness are firing in your brain from you practicing this gratitude. And the same thing with Ping Wang, recognizing that your life is the things that you have, not the things that you've lost. A couple other things we can do is try to move away from this myth we have of independence, that we are that American cowboy or cowgirl on the hill, and we have to do everything ourselves. Doesn't work. Doesn't work at the beginning of life, doesn't work at the end of life, and it isn't really that great in the middle. What we want is interdependence, reciprocity, generosity, and sharing. And another thing that I would say is a lesson I learned from Helen Moses, who was one of the people in the book. And she lived in a nursing home, and she had found the second love of her life there with a man named Howie. And they were kind of this odd couple because Helen was really dynamic and Howie had had a severe brain injury and he was a lot slower than her. And I often wondered what Helen got out of this relationship. And she said to me once, she said, I take care of him because he's an only child and he had nobody. And then when his mother and father died, he really had nobody except me. I try to be everything to him. I think that I am. And so this was the simplest thing, is like, how do we measure our lives by how useful we are to other people?
Oh, nice.
And to just recognize that the people that let us help them, to do things for them, be beneficial to them, are doing us a favor at the same time we're doing them a favor. And we all
have that. Don't be so focused on your perception of independence.
Right. And you know what? We all know somebody who could use a call today, just to say, hey, you know what? I was thinking about you. How you doing? Mm-hmm. And we don't make that call. But 9 days out of 10, we don't make that call. On the 10th day, you make that call, and that's your best day of the week, you know? And yet we don't do it. So you know, if the people watching this can do anything today, think about that one person in your life who can use that call. Hey, thinking about you. How you doing? Okay, yeah. Things are kind of okay for me too. Just wanted to check in. Let's do this again soon. Boom.
I love that. And it can be that simple. Just that call. It doesn't have to be recapping where you've been for the last month or whatever. No apologies, just thinking about you, just establishing that connection.
Right. Instead of saying, oh, geez, Kathleen's got such big problems. I can't solve her problems. I don't want to call Kathleen. Mm-hmm. Kathleen doesn't want me to solve all her problems. She could just use like a nice hello in the middle of the afternoon.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great advice.
So those are three really simple things that we can all do. Or actually four, you know, the live for the things you can still do, practice gratitude, measure ourselves by how useful we are to other people, and sorry, there's another one I'm thinking of. But I think the fourth one would be kind of just to take measure of the things that mean something to us in our lives. Mm-hmm. Where did we find meaning? If we looked back on our life now, what does it mean? What is the significance? What do we want now? How do we have purpose? How do we create purpose for ourselves? And that would be that's kind of a long-term project that we should be practicing all through our days, but we can do it.
I think particularly now with this global pandemic, it might be a time when we'll stop and take stock of meaning and purpose. How have you found these 4 lessons and the other lessons to kind of hold up during COVID? Have you found greater resonance in all these teachings during this time?
Oh gosh, you have to remember that all these lessons come out of adversity, right? All the wisdom in this comes out of adversity. It's not, and they're thousands of years old. They've been through plagues worse than this one before. So they've held up over time. And what I say is, in the same way we do all this stuff to protect ourselves from the virus now, right? We also can do things to protect ourselves from the blahs, the blues, not from depression, because depression is its own thing. And you know, it's really a medical problem that requires medical care. But just from that kind of boredom or despair of it all, we can do some of the things I talked about just a moment ago to keep ourselves out of that funk. Because we all know that there's people out there, we have friends, and some of them are dealing well with this, and some of them aren't dealing well with it. And I'm talking just the emotional, psychological element of it. And if you step back and look at what's the difference between one and the other, it's really the mindset. It's really the kind of attitude with which they wake up, more than the circumstances around them. So we often talk about how we fix our circumstances, how if we only had, that great kitchen, we'd be happier. If we only had this, we'd be happy. It doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way. But the mindset we wake up with in the morning, if we can change that mindset, and we can be more, have a greater sense of well-being and contentment and satisfaction in our lives.
I think that's so true. And when you read this book, and I would say if you have somebody that's struggling with how to deal with this, buy this book, give it to them, because you get immersed in these stories of people who, as you're saying, different walks of life, different levels of expectation, not the most money in the world, and they are happy where they are. It's all inside. So it's a great time to spend a little time in self-reflection, since you can't go out to dinner, you can't go to a play, and you can't go to a concert. This is a time you can invest in yourself and say, what else can I do? And seek internally to think differently about your circumstances.
And just maintain that contact with the people around us.
Mm-hmm.
So important in this time. Don't think, well, I have nothing on my mind today. I'm not going to see somebody, or I'm going to pass today. It's too much work. I don't feel like doing that. Make that call. The telephone is our friend right now. I think that we have so many people trying to push us onto these video platforms. Sometimes it's great. Sometimes it's not so great. Figure out what works for you and do that.
And I do think you're right in that connecting with people can be as simple as picking up the phone. Sometimes it is more complicated, especially if you're trying to reach someone older, to set up a FaceTime or a Zoom, and you get FaceTime and someone's nose there. So just call and just reach out, or call that friend you haven't talked to in a while and just connect.
I often get asked by younger people, or by people who are concerned about younger people, how they can establish these relationships with elders in their lives. And I will often suggest that one of the best things to do is handwritten correspondence, because it's moving away from these media in which the young people are the experts to a different kind of medium where the older people might have more experience writing a handwritten letter. And on that ground, all of a sudden, that elder person in your life is the master in the way that you might not be. Or you're the master in the way that your child or grandson might not be.
I love that. And it really sets up the same philosophy with which you approached your series of columns in your book, that these are the experts. So why not learn from them? So some young people don't even know cursive. So why not reach out and learn something from older adults?
And just think back. When did you last receive a handwritten note, handwritten letter? Okay. How did you feel when you got it?
Yeah.
Wouldn't you like to enable somebody else to have that feeling?
Oh, absolutely. And they're the first things you open. If you are lucky enough to get a handwritten note, you're going to open that before all the bills, all the direct mail, everything else, because it's to you. It's personal. And that's increasingly hard to find. And
Yes.
we'll have time to do that now during this enforced isolation.
Yeah, and we don't need to write War and Peace to people.
Yeah.
We can just send a little note. Gosh, I wish I could have shared today's sunset with you.
Oh, that's a great thought. That's a great way to think of starting something, or just to share a moment. I talk to older adults and I encourage them to write into their alumni magazines of their colleges, and they say, well, I don't know. And I said, you don't have to summarize your life. Just tell people where you are, what you're doing, and how to reach you. And people love to hear that, and they want to be able to connect with others.
And if you don't know who to write to me, because I love to get those letters. I don't get nearly enough.
And we will have your address and email in the show notes so you can be prepared for our next series.
Well, in truth, as a journalist, most of the handwritten letters any of us gets are like 7-page, single-spaced, handwritten notes from someone in a prison who was put there incorrectly, and they'll send us these long cries for help.
Missives. Well, I have to ask you, what is your next project, John? What are you working on now? You've already had 2 books. Do you have a third one in the pipeline, or are you focused on something else?
I had a book that I was interested in doing, and then when the pandemic came along, I felt I didn't want to be working on a book right now. Mm-hmm. I wanted to really be dealing with the things I needed to deal with, the people who I needed to work with. So I haven't been working on a book. I've been working at the Times. I spent a couple months on the obits desk, which I had never done before.
Wow.
And you know, that's you call someone up, you know, it's calling up strangers and tell me the best thing about your father. You know, tell me the absolute best thing about this person that you work with.
Oh, that's a wonderful privilege to be able to summarize a life in that way. And I think it sounds like what you're taking the advice that you learned, which is to really be in this moment that none of us have experienced in our lifetimes, and absorb it, not shunt it to the side in favor of something else.
That's what I'm trying to do. And I will be honest, I have the good days and the bad days too. But now I know how to get from one to the other. I have a better sense of how not to dwell on the things that would bring me down.
Well, I appreciate you spending time with us today and sharing these fantastic lessons. I loved this book, and if you haven't read it, please go out and get Happiness is a Choice You Make, Lessons from the Oldest Old by John Leland. I'd like to thank John for sharing all of his insight with us today. And again, if you have questions for John, include them in our website and our show notes, and we will get to John and get back to you with your questions. So it's been wonderful talking with you, John. Thank you so much for spending time with us today.
Oh, Kathleen, it's great reconnecting with you.
Thanks to our show sponsor, the Riverwoods Group, Northern New England's largest family of nonprofit retirement communities, where active adults find community, purpose, and peace of mind. Visit riverwoodsgroup.org. That's our show for today. Did it spark a question? If so, send us your questions at seniorityauthority.org and we'll track down the answer. Meanwhile, don't forget to subscribe, like us on Facebook, follow us on YouTube, and rate us on your favorite podcast platform. Until next time, let's get smarter about growing older.